I'd like to introduce our plenary speaker, Eva Nico, and she is a director at FSG, a nonprofit social impact consulting firm specializing in strategy and evaluation and research. And their goal is to help organizations and communities reimagine social change. That's amazing. And if you know anything about FSG Group, you know that if it comes in your email every week, you don't want to miss that, because this is an amazing group of directors that are academics, intellectuals, and really want to lead social change in our country. So I appreciate the work of the FSG Group, and so pleased that we have someone to represent them here today. So let me tell you a little bit more about Eva. She has over 10 years of experience designing strategies and promoting practices that lead to powerful results for foundations, corporations, and nonprofits. She manages teams and leads problem solving on engagement, tackling complex social issues in health, education, and fostering vibrant communities. Eva's worked on FSG's far-reaching knowledge-sharing efforts, maybe we'll hear about that today, including research featured in the Social Innovation Review and at prominent conferences in philanthropy across the nation, perhaps internationally too. Prior to joining FSG, Eva was a management consultant with McKinsey & Company, where for 4 years she served Fortune 500 corporate clients as well as high-profile nonprofit clients. Eva is a Rhodes Scholar and holds a PhD in physics, of all things, from the University of Notre Dame, and, she has a PhD in physics from Oxford University and a BA in physics from the University of Notre Dame. And so we're just really, really pleased that she came from the Bay Area to share with us some of the most important issues that we're all facing as we deal with complexity in our communities and our attempts to improve and make social change. So I'd like to invite Eva to come up. Thank you so much, Eva.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And I brought my phone, but I promise, even though I'm from the Bay Area, I'm not going to take calls in the middle of the presentation. Instead, I just want to make sure that I keep you all on track, kick off the day, and give you a good start to some of the amazing discussions that you're all waiting to get into. Let me switch from this beautiful picture to another PowerPoint. So I want to take you on a little bit of a journey. I think Adam has already started us off with that, a journey into maybe the shadows, so I'm going to go with that analogy, and a trip into a landscape that may seem kind of familiar, but also a little bit different if you do shine a light on it. Now, Kathy has graciously given my official bio, which is full of wonderful names and titles, but I want to give you a little bit of the backstory on how a PhD in physics has come to be here in a room full of nonprofits and foundations wanting to change the world, change their communities. So the story began probably about 17 years ago. I was a good physics student at the University of Notre Dame, taking lots of classes, getting A's, when two professors came to me, one in physics and one in history, and said, Eva, you've got your nose to the grindstone, you're getting those A's, but is that really good enough? Are you really looking at how you can help to change the world? And I said, no, I'm an undergrad, I'm getting through my classes, but it got me thinking. And I thought, well, okay, I'm actually a first-generation immigrant. My family came from Poland. I came from Poland when I was 12, and I said, well, let's take a little bit look outside of the university. I'll spend a summer in Poland, I'll muck around, I'll have a new purpose. Well, of course, after that summer experience, after 2 months, I didn't come out with a new purpose. I just came out with more questions about what was going on at the time with my country, the tremendous changes that it was going through. I left the country when it was under the Soviet regime. I came back to it when it was going through a peaceful transition and really changing into a democratic country. So I didn't come back with a lot of answers. I came back with more questions. I decided to keep going with physics. I was lucky enough, privileged enough to have a Rhodes Scholarship and go to the University of Oxford to study physics. And there I did some amazing experiments. I mean, I had amazing tools, crazy magnets, super cold temperatures to do some really interesting problem solving on what turned out to be very simple ordered systems. Crystals grown by chemists. So I was using this incredibly complicated machinery to study some very simple problems. Well, that wasn't honestly interesting enough, and it didn't really matter to the people that I saw out there. It didn't really matter to me as someone who came, as an immigrant to a new country. So I said to myself, well, okay, maybe business is going to have some interesting challenges. So I went to McKinsey. They do a great job recruiting. They were looking for someone who wasn't afraid of numbers. I was looking for someone who could, show me the inside working of some of the companies. And there, I did some amazing work. It was interesting, but again, it turned out to be that business problems were kind of simple. I mean, you've got one motive, you want to generate a profit. You've got very clear metrics. You've got a lot of resources. I was kind of working, optimizing a little bit around the edges, a little bit more sale, a little bit more profit. So I started to look around, and I found a colleague who also left McKinsey at the time. She was at something called Foundation Strategy Group. In case you're wondering what this alphabet soup of FSG stands for, that's how we started, Foundation Strategy Group. And when I met with her the first time, she sat down with me, she said, look, we are trying to reimagine the approaches, the problem-solving methodologies to the world's toughest issues. Well, I was hooked. I knew that this was going to be the place for me. So I feel really privileged to be in this room with you all today because you are working on some of the messiest and toughest challenges in the world today. And I want to be with you on that journey and help you on that journey. So the title of my presentation, Acting, Strategic Philanthropy for a Complex World. You see that, once you hear that word complex, you'll probably start seeing it in a lot of places. I know I did. If you look at your program, it actually comes up in a few of the descriptions of the sessions. Probably if you look in the news, you might also see it. The Santa Fe, the world sort of recognized Santa Fe Institute is right here in New Mexico. They do work around complexity, modeling complexity and complex interactions. I mean, in some ways, I felt like being called in here from the Bay Area is like, bringing sand to the desert. I mean, you all are thinking about these issues actively. So I thought about, right about now, you probably might be getting a little bit worried. She's using complexity. She's talking about the Santa Fe Institute. You probably are thinking, maybe my presentation is going to start talking about nonlinear systems that don't satisfy the superposition principle. Maybe you're thinking, maybe we're going to start talking about causal theories of emergence, where emergent properties or structured wholes are caused by the influence of the whole on the sum of the parts. You might be looking for, that coffee break and trying to get out of the room. Well, fortunately for you, I have taken this journey from physics through to McKinsey, through to FSG, so we're not going to be talking like that. But I do want to serve as a little bit of a guide for you into some of this new terminology and really some of the fundamentally different way that people are thinking about the problems that we face. So I really want to do 3 things with you. I want to define emergent strategy and why it's important for particularly social sector organizations working on complex issues. I want to share with you 3 approaches that are guiding new practices and some examples of foundations who are thinking about them and working with their partners, their nonprofit partners in these ways. And I also want to share with you one very specific technique that comes out of sort of the biology inspirations of complexity thinking that I hope you can take home with you and use in your organization in your life. Now, pretend for a minute that you are Caesar for this next 50 minutes or so, and you have an opportunity to thumbs up, I'm not so sure where this is going, or thumbs down on the direction that this presentation is taking. I want to be responsive to your needs and your ideas, so this is what I propose with you today. How are you feeling about it so far? Be honest, it's fine. Good, so some thumbs up, some people maybe not raising their hand because they're not sure that, where we're going. That's fine, sounds good. So first of all, let's talk about this idea of emergent strategy and what is it? So emergent strategy is a rigorous and flexible pattern of action toward intended goals developed with an understanding of the nature of complex social problems. So it's a way of acting. It is, every one of us, I think, wants to be strategic. You probably want to be strategic about your day today and who you're going to talk to and when you're going to get your coffee. You want to be strategic with your organizations because you want to know where you're going. You want to attract some resources to the issues that you're trying to solve. You want to be strategic about your partnerships. So it seems like a good idea being strategic. But what kind of strategic thinking, what kind of ways of formulating strategy actually make sense when you think about the kinds of issues that we work on? That's what I want to delve into with you today. Now, complexity science, complexity theory, these terms, they're not FSG inventions. It's been work that's been happening over, decades. I think it's come to a new prominence partly because of the computer technology that's allowing us to sort of peer into complex systems and start to realize that there are some patterns that we might want to pay attention to in those systems, even though they look really messy. So maybe a good starting point is to think about the kinds of issues that we face. And Brenda Zimmerman, an expert on complexity, took this very direct and I think very approachable way of thinking about problems that I want to share with you. So first of all, problems, there are different types of problems out there. Some of them can be thought of as simple. For example, baking a cake. How do I bake a cake? You have a recipe. Even if you're a novice, you follow that recipe, and you'll probably get something that looks like cake. Now, it may not be fabulous. It may not be the top chef's cake, but it's going to be one. Those are simple problems. In our world, we might be thinking about some of the grant-making processes or some of the grant, filling out the grant applications. They're sort of like recipes in and of themselves. And remarkably, for a field that's diverse like this, some of these processes look very the same. I mean, it should sort of make your head scratch why it is that we're all making grants in some pretty similar ways and some pretty similar timeframes when we're working on some pretty different and pretty fast-changing issues. Now, there are other problems that you can think about as complicated, like sending the rocket to the moon. So there is no recipe, but there are protocols, there are formulas, there's experts you can call into the room that you need to assemble, and if you've sent one rocket, you learn enough such that you can send the next one more successfully, and the next one even more successfully and efficiently. A lot of our philanthropy and approaches tend to treat the world around us as though it was all simple, there's best practice, we just need to apply it. or even all complicated. There's, good practice, there's promising practice, we just need to, get enough experts in the room and scale it. But many of the problems that we work on are actually what are termed complex problems. And you'll see the theme of children and babies, and I'll continue that theme. I have 2 little ones at home, a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. And raising a child could be thought of as a complex issue. So what does that mean? No expert is going to help you raise your child. When I think about, what I do with my little Jack, it's a little bit different than what I do with Charlotte. It's not the same. Even though I'm trying my darnest, there's no guarantee that they're going to, be successful. I'm trying my best. They could make some wrong choices down the line. So this problem, there are no right answers or protocols in spite of the shelves of books out there on child raising. There are many factors that influence the problem, and experience does help. I'm getting a little bit better at it, but in no way does it guarantee ultimate success. So in the social sector, we try to think about things as simple and complicated, but we often miss the fact that they're in fact complex. And we are inevitably, with people problems and the scale of issues that we're working on complex problems. So it's kind of like you're all trying to send a rocket to the moon, except the moon is thinking, I don't want anybody to step on me, I'm gonna move away, right? I mean, the moon in some ways is reacting to the way that you're trying to approach it. Well, let's see how we can navigate through that. I love this little video from David Snowden, another thinker on complexity, and it continues a little bit our children's theme about what it means to act in response to the way that you think about a system or you think about a problem. As with technology, I'm gonna hope that it works. Oh, okay, maybe not. Let's try. Thank you.
So is this moment complicated or complex?
Ooh, it's both complicated because we're talking about technology and there is a right answer, and complex because I feel embarrassed about it not working in the moment. Thank you. Wonderful.
Let's imagine, if you can, that you've got to organise a party for a bunch of 11-year-old boys, and you want to apply the 3 different types of systems that apply in nature. Well, if you assume the party is chaotic, the children are acting at random, you might as well buy the drugs and alcohol so the children can go on a personal experience of self-discovery. Perhaps may burn down in the process, but what does that matter? All property is theft and it was socially constructed in the first place. I have friends in California who've tried this. I don't recommend it. The recovery cost is high, but it's a legitimate approach. On the other hand, the one we'll be more familiar with is the order systems approach. Here, it's of critical importance to construct clearly articulated learning objectives in advance of the party itself. The learning objectives should, of course, be aligned with the mission statement for education in a society to which you belong. Ideally, you should print the learning objectives off on motivational posters with pictures of eagles soaring over valleys and water dropping into ponds. Place those around the room where you're going to hold the party. You then produce a project plan for the party. The project plan should have clear milestones throughout the party against which you can measure progress against ideal party outcome. Once you've done that, the senior adult can start the party with a motivational videotape. After all, you don't want the children wasting time in play which isn't aligned with the learning objectives of the party itself. And then they should use PowerPoint to demonstrate their personal commitment to the objectives of the party and to show the children how pocket money is linked to the achievement of the milestone targets. Now, of course, the third approach, the complexity approach, is even simpler. Here we draw a line in the sand known as a boundary in complexity theory, and we turn to the children and say, cross that, you little bastards, and you die. One of the things you learn pretty fast as an adult is the value of flexible, negotiable boundaries. because rigid boundaries have a habit of becoming brittle and breaking catastrophically. We then use catalytic probes, and I'm deliberately using the jargon of complexity theory now. Football, a videotape, a barbecue, a computer game, something which will stimulate a pattern of activity which is called an attractor. And if it's a beneficial attractor, we stabilise it, we amplify it. If it's a negative attractor, we dampen it or destroy it fairly quickly. So what we do is we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries. And in that simple phrase, we see the promise of complexity theory for organisations and government alike.
Well, I heard a few chuckles. I also promise I'm going to organize my Charlotte's 6th birthday party, not according to the chaotic theory of systems. I will try to manage it, even though I live in California, according to the complexity theory thinking. So let's talk a little bit about some of the properties of complexity, and in particular of complex systems that make a difference, that make us think that we should respond in different way in terms of our strategies and approaches. So there's a little bit of jargon here. I'll go through it fairly quickly. Some of the properties, the things that you see, are emergent, meaning that they come as a result of interaction of many parts where the sum of these interactions is greater than what you might expect on the basis of any one of them. So if I think about sort of a physics analogy, it would mean, a molecule of hydrogen and oxygen has different properties than water, which is really a system, an assembly of these molecules interacting with each other. So what you might expect from an individual molecule is different than shows up when they all get together and start interacting. That's fundamentally what it means to be emergent. So one person acting on its own self-interest, fundamentally there is a different set of properties, a different set of phenomena that emerge when you get many of these people together with many different interests interacting. The issues that we work on are often systemic, meaning, what does cause poverty? Why has it been around for such a long time? We've declared wars on it. It's still around, and in fact, for many people, the problem is getting worse. These are systems issues. They're a result of many different elements and their interactions. And these elements, as I mentioned in the case of my sort of rocket to the moon, they're not static. They don't just stay in one place. They change, and in our world in particular, they change as a result of the information that is shared. So in our working on people issues, when you hear about something new, you tell someone else, they might actually do something different as a result of that, and the whole system has changed again. So I loved some of our physics problems that I was working on because you could throw a rock, and boy, if you have a formula and you can predict where that rock is going to land. And that feels really satisfying and good. But if you throw a bird into the air, the bird has its own sort of mind, and it decides its own flight on the basis of a lot of different parameters. And no matter how many birds you throw, they're not going to land in the same place. They're going to go all over the place based on the local circumstances. So these problems are adaptive. Now, why are we talking about this now, and why are you going to see the word complexity more now than ever before? Because the world is getting more connected. And I went on the internet, which is in itself an example of the increasing connection amongst us. And you see on the bottom there, faster movement of information, the level of internet connectivity across the world. It's possible to share a lot more with a lot more people. We also have faster movement of people, and the middle picture represents the flight paths that our flights are taking. And we see some of the sort of byproducts of that phenomenon even in the news today as we're talking about epidemics and the spread of epidemics. We also talk about the faster movement of energy and materials, and the picture above is a picture of the shipping lanes across the world and how much stuff physically is moving around. So there are more and faster connections and more interdependence, which means more complexity. Now I had to think hard also, well, what does this mean for us here at home in New Mexico? And I am pretty new to the state. This is only my second visit. It's Halloween, I have to fly off today. So I'm not going to pretend to know the complexity of the issues that you deal with. But when I looked just even on your website and a quick scan of the news, I see that you're talking about, how you use some of your scarce natural resources, in particular water for the state, where there's a huge amount of interdependence and connection. How you think about the health in your state and the continued rise of the obesity epidemic. Maybe we've hit a stable point, it's still unacceptably high. How you think about some of the issues on unemployment, economic stability, and in particular for your state, I saw a lot of conversation around child poverty and what it means to be almost the sort of the last state in the nation to have the highest rate of child poverty per capita. So all of these challenges can in some ways be viewed as complex, and it's a helpful lens to look at them in that way. So another Caesar moment, I'm interested in knowing in your work as an organization, so think about what you're trying to do, the sort of stable environment, which might make you think ordered system, things are stable, I'm kind of managing my course, I know where I'm going, versus what might be complex and a complex environment. Things are changing fast, I've got to react, I don't really know exactly how to get to shore in that condition. I'm interested in knowing, who here in this room feels like they're generally operating on the left. Just raise your hand. The course is plotted, we know where we're going, the goal is clear. A few people. Good. It means, you're probably noticing something about the kinds of issues that you're working on, and maybe things are not changing that fast for you, and you can sort of plot a course to a goal. What about on the right-hand side? How many people are feeling like, boy, things are changing fast, I'm not quite sure? Okay. More, definitely more even in that corner. That would be an interesting corner to exchange some thoughts with. And it may be that in some parts of your work you're feeling, that both are happening. There are some parts that are, we know the course, we're going for it, and there are some parts that are unstable. And we really want to focus in on some of those unstable parts. So you might be asking yourself some questions. Why are these problems still around in spite of our best efforts? We've been funding, we've been working, why are they still here? Some of you may be acknowledging to yourselves, well, my foundation or my organization can't solve it on their own, right? So how are we going to find opportunities for greater impact? You might be thinking, how can I respond more effectively? How can I tune into the changes more and respond more effectively? So many of these social problems, I would posit, exist within complex systems, and they do require a different orientation to the work. So what is that orientation? What does it mean? It's not enough for me to just say, just be different. Let's talk a little bit about how. So first of all, when you're working with complexity, you do have to realize that maybe the answers are not in fact just out there and all you need to do is import them. Maybe the answers are not answered, they're undetermined, and you need to be okay with that you're working on these issues, the answers are not clear, but you're willing to continue to invest effort and work on them because we need the answers. And that learning by doing is key. Now, the typical approach is, we're going to plan for a while, we're going to work for an even greater while, and maybe we'll look back and see what happened and see what we can pick up from that. Well, that needs to be turned on its head. In an emergent world, you can't plan too much. You don't know what's going to be happening. It's not under your control. You actually have to start doing and trying some things, and maybe in the venture capital sort of world which surrounds me, I'm not a part of, but which surrounds me, you talk about the idea of spread betting. A venture capitalist doesn't know which of the innovations, which of the small startups they invest in is going to hit the jackpot, but they know that if they make sort of a certain number of investments, that maybe some of them will. And success is separated by the few that can make those investments where the company goes big. So even in our philanthropy world, you're not looking for the perfect intervention that you're going to release, upon the world. You have to do a little bit of experimentation, a little bit of spread betting on what might work in your local circumstances. And then finally, you do want to talk about co-creation. And you'll hear a different phrase for it in some ways. Collective impact is one example of co-creation. But it's essentially not, strategy can be very dangerous when created behind your desk. You need to be together and exchanging ideas with people in order to understand what might work, what others are willing to try. So you do need to get together, whether it's on the phone, through the internet, in meetings like this, in order to co-create a strategy. And again, this isn't necessarily new thinking. I mean, there are business school sort of professors talking about it. Henry Mintzberg is one, which say, many people focus a lot of attention on crafting the intended perfect strategy. Lots of analysis have a strategy. But what happens is they pursue it, and when it comes into contact with the real world, some of the stuff doesn't get done. It's unrealized. Some new things come along because there are new opportunities that you respond to. And so your realized strategy is a combination of the emergent, what happens as a result of sort of new circumstances, and maybe your deliberate path. Now, this might seem like a blinding flash of the obvious. Why is it taking, MBAs and Harvard, and professors to think about this? But it's incredibly hard to do, and it's actually very different than most people, even in business, think about what to do about strategy. There's a ton of focus on planning, and there's less focus on actually doing and experimenting. And some of the more successful organizations in industries that do change fast, like tech, don't spend a lot of time on planning. They spend a lot of time on prototyping and trying things. Now, I don't mean to say that you don't need to have an intentional goal and that we're just throwing everything out, the baby out with the bathwater. You do need to have an intention and a goal, some notion of where you're heading, where the North Star is in that boat analogy, what you're trying to accomplish. You do try to have some testable hypotheses about what it's going to take to get there. The problem is that in philanthropy, sometimes our hypotheses, when they get written down into theories of change, they solidify. Right? They take on such an important meaning, and your personal worth is attached to them because you thought about them, and they're not hypotheses anymore. They're theories that you're just proceeding on. We do talk about having metrics and data-driven decision making. That data also has to take some investment and has to take some investment to come out. And we often find both funders and nonprofits are hungry for more information about what's going on the ground. So, you want to keep some of these elements of intended strategy without solidifying into them. And you also want to have your ear to the ground. So think about adaptation and evolution change. You want to think about a focus on relationship building and co-creating strategy with others. You want to think about learning and developing an agenda for learning. And you also want to think a little bit about, taking a scan about what's going on out there in continuous sensing. So there are many ways to be strategic. A lot of these words, you may be thinking, well, this might make sense for me. How do I go about it? How do I think about doing it? So let me share with you 3 sort of ideas or approaches, and then some examples of foundations that are putting this into practice. So first of all, there's this approach to co-creating strategy, which just simply means engaging with other people meaningfully. Not just to say, here's what I'm doing, but to ask the question, what should we be doing together? What do you know about this problem that I don't know? How can I share with you something that I know about it that you may not know? Second, we talk about this idea of, I love David mentioning attractors, sensing momentum, sort of stable points in the system where you can actually, put more energy behind something that seems to be beneficial, and perhaps take away some energy, take away some of the attention from something that isn't. And then finally, improving system fitness, and I think this is an important one, in particular for funders to think about, which is, we're used to investing in individual programs, We're used to investing in individual organizations. What about the fitness of the group, and not just even the nonprofit sector, but of collaboration across sectors? What about the ability of these groups of actors to have better relationships, so there's a better exchange of ideas and more willingness to act? What about the ability of all of these players to use information and have information that they need to do their work? Who is investing in that? I think we as a field have actually moved away from those kinds of investments in favor of, particular programs. And I think that is not the right approach for the kinds of problems that we face. So let's talk a little bit about Emily Tao and the Tao Foundation. So this is a family foundation in Connecticut, and they did, good grant making on causes that were of interest to family members, good causes for a while. And they said, this is good, but we're not really necessarily noticing any significant change as a result of these efforts. We're plugging away, we're contributing, but not much change is happening. So we need to think a little bit about focus, and we don't know enough about these issues to just, pick an issue and pick a strategy. Let's engage with others. So they did. They didn't start with, here's how we're going. They did start with searching their soul about the issues that they were motivated by and cared about, and honed in on juvenile justice as an issue that was affecting the youth in their state. They looked inward for that, but they looked outward for what to do about it, for the strategy. So they got people in and went to people to talk to them, to the court system, to the social services system, to understand what was happening with youth and with people. They were the first ones to invest in the Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance, which is an advocacy organization. They were the first funder to step up and invest in that. And that's become a focal point of activity for information of what's happening in the juvenile justice system, how are youth affected and outcomes affected, and what can we do about it. And as a result of these co-creation efforts, they honed in on some strategies to think about school discipline. And for example, how is it, they noticed that a lot of kids were being disciplined for actually not major infractions. They were missing school. As a result of that, they got into a vicious cycle where essentially they dropped out and they became, great targets to be involved in gang activity and criminal activity. They also looked at their state and they said, well, when you look at the outcomes for 16 and 17-year-olds in our state, and what happens to them when they get tried in the adult court system and when they get through that system and into jails, it is a downward spiral of effects. And it's a human tragedy for them as individuals, and frankly, it's a tragedy for our state who's spending all these resources on huge prisons. So they started to look at that, and they, with the help of the Juvenile Justice Alliance, helped to pass a legislation that said that only in exceptional cases do 16 and 17-year-olds get tried as adults. In general, they go into the juvenile court justice system, and they have much more hopeful and better outcomes in that system. And obviously, they're working on improvements in that system itself as well. But they didn't do it by sitting behind a desk and plotting, how am I going to get from here to there. They got together with people and invested in actual organizations that really brought some information to the table. And they're not a big organization, 2 people, I think a total budget of grant making of $15 million over 12 years. So they weren't a huge foundation. I'm gonna go to a little bit the polar opposite of that with this example around working the attractors and sensing momentum. And it's when the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation did get involved in the tobacco campaigns and the tobacco wars. And they were late to the game, right? They didn't get involved on the ground. We know that in the 50s, I think it was really cool to smoke tobacco, and people didn't even realize the negative health benefits of it. Over the next few decades, there was steady progress to get the information out there, and there were steady rates of decrease in smoking among adults. But what Robert Wood Johnson noticed is that there was a troubling trend in youth that said, underage people we used to have smoking rates of about, 20, actually surprisingly, still even high, 25%, but those rates were on the rise. And at the time they got involved in 1997, those rates were actually at 36% of high schoolers smoking. So, you know, they saw that and they said, well, how are we going to make change in this system? I mean, this is a big trend. We're not in control of anybody's individual decisions, nor do we want to be. But what can we do? So they really thought about, you know, where are the places where there's some potential to shift momentum, and how do we do that? And what they did is they did create an organization with partnership from others who basically served as the voice of the anti-tobacco movement. So what you saw is a lot of individual organizations talking about the harms of tobacco, but none of them really getting through or breaking through to the public or to policymakers. And then you saw a powerful tobacco, you know, mobilized tobacco industry with a single voice pounding away at certain policymakers and putting things a little bit more in their favor. So they got together and they said, we need a voice, a focal point for this movement, and we need to step up and create that, and they need to be out there with a consistent message delivered, you know, through media in a sophisticated way, and targeting some of the policymakers in states that look like they could make some promising reforms on this issue. And they didn't do it alone either. There's a host of partners that they were involved with. But it's clear that they did make a significant contribution to the change. They are now on to other issues. They worked on this issue for about 10 years and still do invest in it. But they did see over that time a drop in the rate of high school students picking up smoking to probably the lowest rate we've seen to date. And they have left behind a legacy of some organizations that still exist and continue on this issue, and of policy change that still promote, you know, that still makes it important for people to, in some cases, be in a smoke-free environment. So then the final example I'll share with you is about, you know, it not just being the parts, it's also the whole being important, systems fitness. And this comes from the Communities Foundation of Texas. Again, not a huge grant maker, not a ton of staff. Texas is, you know, you love it or hate it, but it's got a range of issues that it's wrestling with. And in this case, this organization looked at the issue of working poor in the Dallas area. And the first thing they did is they said, well, do we even, you know, do we have an issue? What is the issue? And what was surprising, you know, they commissioned a little bit of research, not a lot of research, a little bit of research to understand what was going on, and they shared it publicly. And they got an amazing response to that. You know, 300 organizations showed up to the first press briefing. It was in the news. And it struck a chord because it really made people think differently about their community. They said, you know, our community, we think of ourselves as sort of pretty wealthy, up-and-coming, self-sufficient, doing well, yet there are a lot of people, a surprising number of people who are working, who are at or just above the poverty level. And if those people, because of an economic crisis like we just have, if they drop below the poverty line, a lot of negative consequences can happen for them, frankly, the trauma of living in those circumstances, and a lot of negative consequences happen for the economy and for the community. So it's not just their problem, it's our problem as well. And what this foundation did is, you know, they didn't say, well, what are the programs that we could fund out there? Although there were some, but they said, well, how can we think about, you know, really improving the work that those programs are doing in some way? Yes, we're gonna make some of those investments. They do make some direct grants, but they also invested in something called D3, Data-Driven Decision-Making Institute. And it's just basically, it's a commitment on the part of 16 organizations, some nonprofits, some across sector, to come together to really look together at the information about the issue and to learn from it, to use data to drive their programs and their services and changes to them, and to keep that going beyond this initial institute and commitment. And they give them a little bit of operating capital, you know, not programmatic support, operating support, in order for them to participate in an intensive way over a 12-month period to commit to do that and to do that. And they're seeing some, you know, both they're learning a tremendous amount about the programs, they're affecting change in those organizations, and they're affecting change on the issue. So I want to move to the portion where you get to have a little bit of fun too. I've had a lot of fun talking with you. But I want to share with you this one specific framework. You know, we talked a lot about big concepts. For taking some of the ideas from complexity inspired by biology and bringing it into your work. So this is called the eco-cycle framework. Again, not an FSG creation at all. We were introduced to it by Brenda Zimmerman. There are a lot of people who use it and think about it. But essentially, you know, if you're in business or have come from the business world, you might recognize the development, growth, maturity part of the curve. I think it's pretty much taught in every single business school program. It's the growth cycle, right? It's, you know, you have some products, they're new, you invest in them, they get some traction, they grow, they become mature, they might become your cash cows. You know, let's hope for that. Well, what's interesting is that the business world completely drops off the back end of this cycle, right? That, in fact, there is also release. In some cases, this is called destruction. Essentially, some of these products, you know, many of the Fortune 500 companies that we have around today actually didn't exist 50 years ago. So there is, you know, businesses go away, products go away, there is release. And there's also something called exploration, meaning, you know, this is a messy phase, in which case you might have the nugget, the beginning of an idea, but it's not formulated enough to invest in. You might actually be sort of meeting with other people to explore it, to form it a little bit more. It's new, it's something different for you at least. So what I would love for you to do is to take a piece of paper. There are some pads at your table, there are some pens, or you might have some in hand. And, you know, draw this little infinity loop on the page, and keep in mind these growth phases of, you know, development. This is about new ideas, experimentation. This is about, you know, a tolerance for risk. Not all of these will work, not all of these will survive. Think about things that are in the maturity sector, where, you know, you're chugging away, you've got plans, they're moving along. Think about those projects. Think about which of your projects might need to be released, meaning, you know, perhaps the form of them shouldn't continue anymore. The spirit might continue, right, the sort of the intention, but the actual specific form of it maybe is no longer relevant. Maybe it's actually preventing you from taking on some other things. And then think about your nascent idea, something in the back of your head that might be niggling that you're curious about. You know, you don't have an idea or a program yet, but you're curious to learn more. And there's lots in the program today, you know, lots of places you can take that, into mission investing, into collective impact, into a lot of other work. But ideas that are not fully formulated, just something in the back of your head that you're curious about. And, you know, take about 5 minutes, think about the work of your organization, and plot some of your projects on this curve. Which ones are in development? Which ones are mature? Which ones might need to be released? Maybe it's a hypothesis. Which ones are you curious about that are worth exploring? And I'll just give you 5 minutes to think about that and do that for yourselves. Yes? Some others are busy thinking. Okay. So I won't embarrass anyone to tell me all about what's on their eco-cycle, but I'll give you a few thoughts about how to use it. So first of all, you know, when you switch your mental frame from sort of machines to ecosystems, healthy ecosystems have what is called patch dynamics, meaning they probably got elements of the system in all 4 quadrants at the same time. The analogy that's often used is sort of the forest as an ecosystem, where you've got some bare patches with little seedlings. It looks like not much is happening, but in fact, there are seedlings coming up, and probably too many to thrive. You know, obviously, we used to think of forest as just the big trees. That would be the maturity sort of quadrant, where there are a few where energy gets conserved into bigger trees. The fires are the release, and we used to, you know, think that that was such a bad idea that obviously fires used to be prevented, until in the 70s it realized that that was doing more damage to the ecosystem and causing more destructive fires than was needed. So now there is more of an approach to controlled release, right, doing some all along the way. And obviously the places where there's exploration after the fire, sort of new new assemblies of plants, new assemblies of ecosystems start to kind of poke out. So healthy ecosystems have things going on in all 4 quadrants. When you look at your ecosystem that you drafted, do you think of it as healthy? Are there things going on? Where's the balance? Is it really scary to think about kind of that release quadrant? What do we need to let go of in terms of the way we've been doing things, where maybe we can open up the possibility to do something different and new? So that's that view, and during the day today, use it as an opportunity to connect with others at the conference. Either gather ideas about, things that you're curious about, make some connections, are other people curious about these topics? Seek advice on something that maybe needs to be released. Connect on the potential for resources to develop something new. So I think we're all used to probably talking about the maturity, the great things we think we've got going on. Maybe we can push ourselves to focus on the other quadrant for the day today. So thank you very much for the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with you today. If you want to find out more, and if you want to, I'll call it geek out with me a little bit on what is this stuff all about. If you want to just talk more about how it applies to your work, or if you as a group want to do more on this topic, and I think you are. I saw some of the sessions in the day that are starting to apply some of these ideas and this thinking to the way you approach problem solving, whether it's through collective impact or mission-related investing. If you want to do more about it, feel free to catch me after the talk, and also just to contact me at my email. Really appreciate the opportunity to spend time with you. Thank you.
So if you look at the foundation sector now, and kind of the typical models that we take granted, that we are doing as kind of an ongoing work.
Use the microphone, please.
She's so close. I feel like I have to whisper.
Thank you.
Oh, we're so far.
Hi, I'm Juhi Ren from the Center for Community Foundation. I'm a fan of FSG, so thank you for being here. So if you look at the foundation sector and what we kind of do as part of our work that's granted, what do you think is in the maturity and declining stages that we really need to rethink the model?
Well, I think I mentioned some of that already, but I do think that the point-to-point model of grant making is a little bit overused. Funding one organization, or not even organizations, 1 or 2 programs at a time. And there has been sort of a decrease in the amount of investment in system fitness and the ability of organizations to form relationships with each other and across, not just in the nonprofit sector, but with others. So I would say the point-to-point model should not, it has assumed a significant amount of dominance, and part of it may have been the sort of the need to think about, outcomes and control outcomes and have specific outcomes. But it doesn't really suit, fully the kinds of challenges that we work on. So that point-to-point model should be less prominent, frankly. Other questions?
Just any chance of getting your presentation at all?
Oh, absolutely. I have already shared with Lois, who is going to upload it, and you are feel free to use it. I think one of the things, one of the interesting reactions we've gotten to the paper and the presentation is, people are grappling a lot with this idea of complex problems and complex systems and which part of their work are complex. But where they're maybe not quite turning the corner is, well, what does that mean we need to do, right? It's one thing to sort of intellectually exercise around complexity, but it's another thing to say, well, how do we respond to that? What do we try to do? And I will by no means say that we at FSG have all the answers, and I've tried to really recognize a lot of the thinkers on these issues in my presentation. But we are excited to work with organizations, and we are working with groups organizations, particularly in collective impact, to say, well, how do we apply some of these ideas to the work? And I do think that just even changing your sort of mental picture of what's going on, your analogy from the machine to the ecosystem, does start to get you going already on your own. You don't need FSG to come in and tell you, here's stuff you should invest in. I mean, it starts to change the way that you might be approaching your work, and you're already doing that just by the virtue of being here.
Thank you. You mentioned point-to-point strategies. Where do you see it going from point to point to wherever it's going in the future?
So I do think it's going into collaborations. And collaborations, you will hear more about collective impact type of collaborations, which are one kind of model, which say, across sectors, we need to align around some common goals. We actually need to invest in a backbone for these efforts, because us coming together and sitting in the room isn't going to do it. There needs to be some support that happens for the group to be productive. And there needs to be some data that actually flows through this collaboration. It's not just all coming together with sort of our ideas about what the issue is. There's actual learning and data. Maybe it's not dashboards, maybe it's trips out to see the real issues. But there's some learning and data that needs to be a part of that. So we do see funders increasingly investing, not only in single organizations and programs and trying to scale programs. We are actually seeing funders investing in collaborations of organizations across sectors.
For a lot of nonprofits, philanthropy is one source of revenue, but the government is another. Where have you seen government sort of applying this thinking and innovation?
Well, I haven't seen it because we're not allowed to, but I mean, government is already applying this sort of thinking in the way they think about their military tactics. I mean, it's interesting, the origins of sort of strategy were, part of the military thinking. The way that the military is thinking about defense is applying complexity concepts. In the war on terror that we're fighting, in the information systems that we're, sort of the way that we're thinking about the information systems that we're defending, that's already happening in that way. I have obviously no view into that, other than knowing it's going on and that a lot of that discussion is happening at that level. In terms of more the social sector approaches, I think there are some nascent efforts. The Opportunity Youth effort is one where we've actually had some great interest and engagement from the White House around that approach to making sure that our young people do have jobs and have the skills to pursue them. I think that communities are doing this on their own, and we'll hear about an example of living cities and communities doing this on their own. But in government, there is, just like in business, there is a lot of the planning mentality, right? And a lot of the very heavy accountability mentality for some of these issues, and less so the complexity mentality.
Hi, I'm Robert Valdez with the New Mexico Community Foundation. There seems, this is my observation with other foundations around the country, that there's this adoration for a model around I can't even say the word, replicability and scalability, which has led at least larger national foundations to increasingly avoid investing in small communities and in small states like ours. Your observations about that sort of adoration to that sort of mechanic model, which is always focused on scalability. Well, if you're small scale, you're always going to be small scale. But sort of how the complexity issue plays out in that kind of thinking.
Well, it's a great question. And like all fields, we're all a little bit prone to trends and fads, and I hope that, we at FSG, I'm sure in some ways taking responsibility, we may contribute to that too. And I wanted to offer this presentation not as, some kind of 180-degree radical shift. Stop doing all of that. Drop everything and move to this. I mean, I think this is more of an openness and acknowledgement that this should be a facet of grant making and thinking, and that there frankly should be more spread betting amongst foundations around things that could work that I can't prove to you today are working. And in terms of the scalability aspect, I mean, that's a lot of the work that's happening in this, some of those efforts are in this maturity quadrant. They're efficient, they're effective, they're getting the results. There should be some resources going to them. Otherwise, we're never, going to get the sort of scale of results that we need. But in our writing, I mean, you see the example of even Teach for America, which has gotten a tremendous amount of support from foundations and from the government and others. I mean, they are still a drop in the bucket relative to the size of the issue, to the number of people that are trying to, to the number of youth that we have not graduating. They're still a drop in the bucket. So no matter how much energy you put behind that one organization, you're not going to solve the bigger issue. You're not going to fundamentally make progress on the bigger issue. So I think there is an infatuation with that. We're trying to contribute to a dialogue about maybe a little bit more spread betting. And in particular, I think with the complexity thinking, there isn't something that's just going to work for all communities. There isn't something that you can just import straight from the Bay Area into here and think it's going to work. It is about local change and local efforts. And we work a lot with community foundations themselves and are trying to, help and promote that. One more question, and I think we're...
Thank you. And thank you for your presentation this morning. Alvin Warren with the Kellogg Foundation. My question is, can you speak a little bit to what this means for leadership, particularly in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors? Because I think that kind of linear approach to solving simple and complicated problems has also defined a kind of approach to leadership, the 5 best qualities of effective leaders. But really adaptive leadership is, I think, another school of thought that is coupled with complexity theory. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
It's a great question, and I think it is true that working in this messy sort of complexity space does mean that change is the constant, right? It's not about a particular state, a particular point in time result. Change is going to be the constant, and it means that you as the leader are kind of reacting to those circumstances and adapting and sensing for those kinds of circumstances, on the lookout for that. And it's hard because I've worked with a number of foundations, and even when they're willing, there's the board who are at a different place in terms of their ability to interact with the kinds of issues the foundation is tackling. There's the staff and the leadership of the organization. There's the leadership of the nonprofits that are working on the issues. And even they sometimes can be removed from some of the issues. So there are some real challenges and barriers to working more adaptively. I mean, if you're bound to the cadence of board meeting decisions, that is not necessarily the cadence of some of the changes that are happening in the world. And most board meetings I've been to, an awful lot of time gets spent on reviewing grants, not necessarily actually learning from the past grants that have happened, or reflecting on, well, what are we sensing in this situation? I know we're only 10 or 15 people in the room, but what are we noticing about the way that things are changing, or what should we be paying attention to? Are there some attractors that are emerging? So even literally certain small changes in how you spend your time and the kinds of questions that you ask can lead you to some different places. But it does take, the board chair or the CEO or others who craft those agendas to sort of make the space for that kind of conversation. That sort of somewhat uncomfortable conversation, because nobody has the answers. And boy, we spend so much time, preparing the dockets and preparing the program applications. You don't even want to walk into the room and say, well, I'm not, I know this part of it, but I'm not sure of the whole that's happening here, right? We're afraid to admit that. So, I think the possibility is within us, and there's some great writing. Ron Heifetz has been talking about adaptive leadership for a long time and what it takes. There are some I love the work of some of, Atul Gawande on this topic as well. So he's a leader sort of in healthcare that talks about, even simple things like sort of principles driving action, not plans. Could be a simple switch. Like, what are the principles, the pattern that we're trying to enact? Not what's going to happen tomorrow and, a week from now and a month from now. So I think leaders could tune into and shape those principles much more effectively. Thank you all for asking great questions. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Eva, for coming today. We really appreciate this, and I think this is a great framework for the rest of the day. And I welcome you to join us for our break, and then also for our next breakout session. Thank you very much.